All right, so we're going to start a new mini-study on a topic or a concept called powers and principalities. And the concept really comes to us from the Gospels and from the epistles. And the concept is that Jesus just did not go against or was confronted by individuals. And that when we think about the powers and principalities in Jesus' time, we think about some pretty large institutions. What are some of these institutions that Jesus went against or railed against Jesus?
The synagogue.
The synagogue, right. Okay, so we had members of the synagogue. Who else? Excellent.
No, he did not rail against the Romans, but the Romans were a big...
Yeah, sure. Rome.
Principality.
Well,
Most
I was
definitely.
trying to figure out how to phrase that, but yeah, that's pretty much what I was
Rome,
thinking.
most definitely. Most definitely. And so we have the Jewish religious leaders, right? We can't just say, you know, for generations, people would merely just say, well, the Jews. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, all his followers were Jewish. So it's not the Jews. I mean, the people were flocking to him. The multitudes were coming to him. But it's the leaders,
The organized
right?
religion.
It is the powers, the people who controlled everything. And of course, the Roman state, because they eventually put him on a cross, right? So, it's important to understand, when it comes to the crucifixion, both parties, it's the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman state that put Jesus on the cross, right? It's, again, people have merely blamed, the Jews, and that's just not true. It's, the religious authorities and the Roman authorities, right? No one was able to crucify someone without the Romans having their hands in it. This is a Roman form of capital punishment. So it's important when we think about Jesus to think about the institutions he went against. So it's not just one person, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about Pilate, and when we talk about individuals like Caiaphas or Annas, or the portion of the Pharisees that conspired against him, right? So they have these enormous organizations behind them. We, even as Americans, right, and we know the expression, right? You can't fight what?
City Hall.
You can't fight City Hall. City Hall's a building, though. What are you fighting? It's an institution, right? Even within our music from the 60s and 70s, you hear the concept, the man.
Right.
The man. And everyone knows what the man is. You say the man, but you're really talking about something a lot bigger than just one person. It's an institution, right? Can't fight City Hall, right? So what exactly powers and principalities mean, especially to Jesus, in Jesus' world, is what we're going to discuss perhaps for the next 2 Sundays, depending how long it takes. So, for introduction, I want to read a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is everyone familiar even a little bit with Bonhoeffer?
Yeah.
All right, Lutheran minister. If you've ever been to Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, I think it's already in Harlem, at Union Theological Seminary, which used to be Presbyterian. Bonhoeffer, I believe, taught there. At the onset of the war, he was there. And then, of course, Bonhoeffer makes that decision to go back to be with his people.
We did his book in one of the
Yeah, we
studies.
Yeah, he's a he was a neat person. Really powerful figure within the 20th century Protestant theological understanding. I love Bonhoeffer. He's truly a person who put his money where his mouth is.
His life.
His whole life. Yeah, his whole life, because that's what happens. His life is given for his cause. Yeah. So Bonhoeffer said, how can one close one's eyes at the fact that the demons themselves have taken over the rule of the world? That is, the powers of darkness who have here made an awful conspiracy. Now, who is Bonhoeffer, or what is Bonhoeffer speaking about?
Probably the Third Reich.
Yeah, right, the National Socialists. Yeah, he's talking about the Nazi Party.
Right.
And so when we think about the Bible, powers and principalities, the term, it speaks about earthly powers, so humans, but also Jesus talks about other powers as well, as in Ephesians 6:12. And this, of course, is from, right, the Apostle Paul, St. Paul. Our struggle is not against enemies of flesh, but against principalities, against the powers, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. So, when we think of the Bible, the New Testament, when we think of the Gospels, which, of course, talks about the life of Christ, and when we think about the epistles, the powers and principalities spoken of are earthly, but also heavenly, right? So we think about what goes on behind the backdrop, right? So even if you have modern people who say, well, I don't believe in angels or demons, you know, for the gospel accounts and for the epistle accounts, it really doesn't make a difference because they did, right? And this affects their understanding and the writings, right? It's a very important piece because, as Jesus teaches, as Paul writes, and as the Gospels lay out, this is a huge part of what is pushing against, right? Even, you know, as you go into the book of Daniel, as Daniel is praying, and I believe it's Gabriel who comes to Daniel, and, you know, you almost get the impression that he's huffing and puffing. Oh, sorry, I'm so late. I was battling against, you know, the demons and forces of evil against the king of Tyre. You know, and so you get this, you know, this whole concept of, you know, this backdrop, like a whole area that we just don't see when we think about the angelic host. So when we think about powers and principalities, especially when it comes to us from the Bible, it's both. There's a human aspect to it, and there's a spiritual aspect to it, right? There's the seen and there's the unseen. And so we must keep that in mind as we go through this study. And as we think about the whole concept of powers and principalities, because this is how the authors and the people within the narratives understood their world. And that's why it's important, right? So we study it with our 21st century spectacles on, but we must do our best to put ourselves within the original audience, right? Within the context of when it was written and why it was written. That is hugely important. All right, so there are different ways that theologians look at the text. And the first, I thought it would be interesting to look at a piece that is modern, that is distinctively American, and there was a book written by John Steinbeck, right, that Chuck Campbell honed in on, that deals with a power and principality that was bigger than individuals. And one of Steinbeck's novels deals with this and does a really good job. The novel was highly controversial. Not everyone agreed with it. It was interesting. I was looking at some reviews this morning of it. And it said both members of the left and the right railed against the book. So it was attacked by both sides of the spectrum, but it was also hailed by both sides of the spectrum. So I guess it depended on your perspective. And the book deals with an organization, and that's how the book kind of begins. Does anyone have an idea what book I'm talking about? It's one of Steinbeck. It's known as The Grapes of Wrath.
Grapes.
Excellent. Now, how within and if anyone knows the story of the Joad family, when we think about the Grapes of Wrath, we think about a period of American history where a lot of people fell on some really hard times. Right? There's a major event that happens, and that event, the Dust Bowl, causes a lot of pain. All right, it creates a lot of poverty, and a lot of people are pushed out of professions, you know, or the profession that they knew how to do. Right, this was their vocation, and so within the Grapes of Wrath, the institution that is seen as a power or principality is what? What is the institution?
The banks.
The
right?
banks. Yeah. And this is Steinbeck's perspective, right? Whether you agree with it or not, that's your opinion. But for Steinbeck, it's the banks, right? The banks are the power and principality, right? The farmers, right, who are being pushed out, right? Their farms are being foreclosed, right? Because you take loans from the bank to purchase the seed, right? Or the fertilizer for the year's crops, right? For the year's yield. Now you get a dust bowl effect, right? Everything dies. You cannot sell your crops, which means you're not having, money for goods that you need for you and your family, but that means you can't repay banks.
Right.
Yeah, so within the Grapes of Wrath, of course, the banking system now becomes almost a living organism within the Grapes of Wrath. And within the book, it is the banks these become the primary enemy, especially in the initial part of the book, before they head out, I believe, to California. Right? It is the banks that foreclose on these farms. And as Mr. Joad, I think in the book, I'm trying to remember, he's out of prison, I think he's paroled, and he goes back to find that his farm has already been foreclosed upon. But a lot of farmers, you can't grow crops in dust in that soil that's gone. It's useless, right? It's useless. So it is the banks that now become this instrument, what we would talk about as a power and principality. And I'm just going to read you a couple lines here from Chuck Campbell's book. Rather than serving the ends of human life, the powers now exercise dominion over human beings, restricting, controlling, and consuming human beings in order to sustain and extend the prosper of their own survival. The powers, in short, have become demonic. In Steinbeck's terms, they have become monsters, right? Steinbeck refers to the banks as a monster, right? He's almost giving the banks human traits, right? He's giving them, it's almost like they become a living, breathing beast. Most basically, the powers seek to survive. The fundamental concern is their own survival, and nothing must get in the way of that. Everything else is expendable. Human beings, compassion, humanity, the land, preaching, everything that must ensure the survival. All right? So, according to Steinbeck, right, it is the bank that becomes like a living organism, right, within the great American novel, right? And this is, of course, where the friction comes in, as it's being reviewed, right? No different than, I believe it's Sinclair's The Jungle, right, when he wrote his scathing novel about meatpacking plants, I want to say up in Chicago area, which was also greeted with differing responses. Some people hailed it, some people said, this is all a farce. It's not like this. Same thing with the Grapes of Wrath, right? Farming associations slammed the book saying, no, it was different in California. They welcomed the migrant farmers that were coming in from the Midwestern states, that were affected by the Dust Bowl. But here is this institution that, according to Steinbeck, is now a monster, right? It has become this living, breathing organism, right? And like many organisms, right, the fight for survival or the preservation of life is almost instinctual, right? That it will make sure that it is living. Now, the interesting thing about powers and principalities is that they are created by whom? People. Yeah, we create organizations, right? We do. And many organizations are wonderful organizations. It's not like everything that we create is this monster hiding behind a tree or a rock. We create wonderful organizations. Many of them are benign, many of them are neutral. It's just, you want to shop at this store, you want to shop at that store. Many of them, most people wouldn't categorize as monsters. Here in this novel, however, it's this creation that's created by the hands of humanity that now has a life of its own, right? And so when we think about something like the Grapes of Wrath, within the novel itself, the bankers become tools, right? Tools of the system, right? Or tools of the power, right? And so oppression settles in, right? So this is a modern example, right, through Steinbeck's interpretation of what a power and principality can look like. So powers and principalities are not only theological terms, right? Although there are many religious overtones within the novel itself. People will look at the Grapes of Wrath and say the preacher that Mr. Joad meets up with as he's first paroled is like a Christ-like figure. And when he eventually dies, it's like Jesus dying, and then Mr. Joad becomes the resurrected. So there are some examples of how religion has inspired. No different than if you would study To Kill a Mockingbird. People have always said that Atticus Finch is a Christ-type figure, right? He's a good guy, right? He, when people can't pay him money, he accepts, well, I don't know what it was, hickory nuts. Yeah, he accepts, he barters.
Right.
He barters because he helps people. And Scout is always asking, why do you do this? Why do you do that? And because this is what we do. This is how we act. This is how we're supposed to act. So within these novels, even though it might not outright come, but people will say, of course, it's inspired by, or yes, you can see a Christ-type figure, right? A good figure within the actual novel. So when we think of going back now to the Bible, right, it is a constant pull and push with Jesus and the powers and principalities of his day. He's continually going against them, and they are continually pushing against him. Although it's interesting, when we think about Rome, he doesn't really rail against Rome. He does more railing against his own powers and principalities. It almost, he reminds me in places of someone is saying, that's not my business right now. This is mine, and this needs to be fixed. You are my people,
Yeah.
and we need to fix this.
His feeling was, this is the kind of thing we expect from the state, but
Good.
the religious organizations, you should be better than above them.
Exactly. Right. You should know better. Think about when he's talking with Nicodemus. And this is positive interaction, right? He's not chastising Nicodemus, but it's kind of like a mentor working with a student when he says, it's like you could almost sense him saying, come on, you should know better. You're a teacher. You should be teaching me, right? So he's encouraging Nicodemus to push further. Like, think about what you're coming to me. You should know these things. So even on the positive side, he encourages his people, the Jewish people, because it is more about the interaction between him and his culture, right? He wants to see this fixed. He wants to repair it. He wants to fix it. I've told people before, I used to be friends in my early days in ministry with a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, and he was a neat guy, and he would say to me, Christianity is nothing but the first version of Reformed Judaism. And he's right. I mean, really, think about where we come from. Jesus doesn't just say, well, I'm scrapping all this and coming up with something new and fresh. He basically takes Judaism and he's reinterpreting it.
Yeah.
And he's saying, you have heard it said this, but I say this.
Yeah.
He's reinterpreting the law and trying to fix what he feels that needs to be repaired. Some people go along with him. Some people say, yes, we love these ideas. Even members of the power, even Pharisees, right? Even Pharisees follow along with him. Even in the book of Acts, we hear of Pharisees that are Christianized now, Christians, followers of the way, which is what, Christianity was known before it was known as Christianity, right, or the church.
A lot like Martin Luther, he didn't want to start a new religion either. He
That's
just
correct.
wanted to fix.
Right. He
what
wanted to
was
fix the
there.
church. Right. He wanted to fix the church. Martin his finger was on the pulse right, of the people.
Right.
Right? Martin was also a champion for the people, right? He saw some ills, and in his opinion, they needed to be fixed. Martin also went against powers, right? It wasn't that just Martin went against a local priest.
Right.
Martin went against the whole Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
That's tough to do.
Yeah.
That's tough for anyone to do. Not just the Roman Catholic Church, but any denomination, if one person rails against, or any secular organization.
At the time that Luther did that, there was no other Christian religion, was there?
No,
No.
the church was still
It
one.
was just the Catholic Church, there were no...
That's it.
Well,
In the West.
the East and, yeah.
Well, yeah, right, the East,
West,
correct.
The East and West, it's split.
Correct, correct.
Oh, yeah, the
Thank you, yes.
Orthodox, yeah.
Right,
They-
but
right.
the West was one church.
Yes.
Right.
We always have to remind ourselves that there was another whole church out in the East, or
Right.
the Orthodox, correct. So the Western Church was still one. Right. And Don is correct. Martin really never wanted to leave the church. He wanted to fix it. But, you have to want to be fixed. And so, of course, it's kind of, he's pushed out, and so other things happen, right?
That was the 1400s.
1500s.
15?
Yeah, 1500s.
So when did the Anabaptist thing start?
1500s. The Anabaptists happened not too far after Martin. I would imagine the late 1500s, probably, if I would guess. And yeah, that's a whole other, the rebaptizing. So yes, so when we think about going against the powers and principalities, we must. It all starts with Jesus. Right, and you think about it, and we talked a little bit about this early on, Jesus is tempted in his baptism, right? And who's he tempted by?
In his baptism?
After his baptism.
Oh,
Yep.
say,
Yeah, but the devil, right? So he's baptized by John, and then he is led out into the wilderness, right? So it's kind of like the baptism, we believe this is the watershed. This is the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, right? He's now leaving his old life, perhaps known as merely, the son of the carpenter,
right.
and now he's going to be doing something new, right? So he goes out in the wilderness and he encounters Satan, right? Satan, the accuser, right? And in the wilderness, now we have this duel. Right, and so when we think about the encounter that he has, we must think about what the temptations are. What is being tempted here? What is being tempted? So Jesus is out there, and let's see here. So I'm reading from Matthew 4. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was... Thank you, Miriam.
I got a quick day for my birthday tomorrow, right?
Whose birthday is tomorrow? Alan's?
Right?
Is it?
I'm trying to ignore it.
Is there a way that before church starts, if I can stand there and sing happy birthday to him?
Miriam, we stopped doing that. We'll do that.
Yeah, we'll do it
the
afterwards,
last
downstairs
Sunday
in the
of
fellowship
month.
hall.
Okay,
And then you can do that then, okay?
all right.
Okay, thank you,
Alright.
Miriam.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, so he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. Now, so keep this in mind, Jesus is like weak. We always have to remember Jesus is also fully human, as we know that he was fully divine. So imagine a fully human body fasting that long. Jesus is weak, right? So we would imagine he is at a weak point. And so he weakens himself for this encounter. The tempter comes and says to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But it is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The devil took him to the holy city, placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again it is written, do not put your Lord God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor. And he said to him, all these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. The devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him, so attended him. So when we think about this encounter, right, with Jesus and Satan, we must think about this and think about the temptations. And some of them are offering Jesus something pretty amazing. What do we have? Offers him food. You're hungry. Come on, just do this. But the one that I really look at is the last one. What is he offering him?
Power.
Power.
Take over the world.
Take over the world. Have hold of all of these powers and principalities. Take hold of all of these kingdoms, right? Kingdoms that have been set up by people, right? In some form of fashion. Some of them you have to go way back to find their beginnings. But, they just don't pop up, right? Even Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So, he offers him this. He offers him the ability. And that is alluring for many people. Right? Imagine if, anyone was offered this. I'm sure there'd be a lot of takers. The world is full of highly ambitious people, right? And it goes way back. It goes way back. Julius Caesar was a highly ambitious individual, right? He did a lot of neat stuff. He did a lot of bad stuff. But he was highly ambitious, right? Just being a counselor wasn't enough. He being a general wasn't enough. Being an author wasn't enough. Being a statesman wasn't enough. He wanted to be dictator for life. Well, for him that was enough.
Short life.
That's right. His companions didn't like that. And then of course when you look at Bonhoeffer's his life, when we think about someone like an Adolf Hitler, well, yeah. Again, this is recent history. This is not ancient history. This is,
For some of us, it's our lifetime.
That's right. That's right. I heard, you hear stories from my grandparents and from their siblings who fought in the Great War. And not every society is a negative thing, right? So I don't want to get to say too heavily that everything is, because it's not. But we must understand what it is, right? These are institutions that are set up by people, right? And so they become bigger than the individual, right? They become something different, right? So here Satan offers Jesus all of these kingdoms, right? And so Jesus says, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Boom, he's gone, right? So he takes care of that. So yes, so Jesus is offered this at an early point, and Jesus rejects it. I don't want that. Basically, go. So this is in the beginning. We think of the Beatitudes. We think of, as Jesus writes, he speaks, right? It's the preamble to the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, whichever, whether you're looking at Matthew or Luke, I believe. You have this beginning, the preamble, right? It's kind of like the Bill of Rights. It's the beginning. Except, the Bill of Rights is pretty powerful. And so are the Beatitudes. He comes out swinging at a very, very early part of his sermon. And we think about what he challenges within the Beatitudes, right? And we talked about this when we did Jesus the Revolutionary. These are huge because he is challenging the status quo. What he challenges are what his culture has taught and what the leaders and the powers and principalities have now continued on for centuries. And he's saying, well, you think it's this that is The good, well, I say it's this. You think this is what true power looks like, but I tell you it looks something like this. You think it's the rich, well, I tell you it's the poor. Right? So he is continually going like this and taking and flipping over and flipping over and turning and turning and turning. Now, if you are part of the group that is disenfranchised, if you are marginalized, if you are oppressed, if you are poor in this case, especially the majority of Jesus' early followers were in this category. You hear this for the first time. Well, I never heard anything like this before. I've never heard anyone say anything like this before, right? People begin to follow him in mass numbers. Now, if you're there at the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm sure there were people there who were part of the powers and principalities hearing this for the first time, how do you think it resonates with these individuals?
Not so well.
Not so well. Oh God, what is this guy talking about? This is wrong. This is not what we teach. This is not what we adhere to, right? So it scares some people. It angers some people. It upsets some people. So like anything in any time, you always find people all over the spectrum. You know, like we talked a little bit earlier about the grapes of wrath, how it was received. Some people loved it. It got rewards, awards. I think, I want to say he was it a Nobel Peace? I mean, I think he won a Nobel Prize. I mean, it was received very well. But then again, there were people who railed against it, right? So think about Jesus' teachings. It's no different, right? You had people who said, we love this. No one has ever told us anything like this before. Wow, you're saying that we are valued by God. We've never heard anything like this before. And then you have people who are saying, we don't like this at all. This makes us uncomfortable. This makes us uncomfortable. So Jesus' teachings are met with the same type of criticism that any great work is met with. There's no set thing. Not everyone loves what Jesus says, but not everyone hates it either. Right? It's met with a mixed review. So the Beatitudes challenge the status quo. It challenges the established understanding of what it meant to live within that worldview, what it meant to live within the Jewish Palestinian culture of the first century. Right? He challenges this. He challenges this. Now, there are members of this group who become followers of him. Right? Like we said earlier, Pharisees do follow him. They like what he has to say. They are willing to walk away from what they once understood to something new. They're willing to do that. Just not the majority. Just not the majority. So when you have something like an institution like this, this is very powerful. This is very powerful. Again, Jesus is going against City Hall. Right? He is going against City Hall, and that is a tough thing to do. That's a tough thing to do. In times, Jesus gets very active, very animate, even violent, right? We think about the temple, when he cleanses the temple. That scene was absolutely wild. It was absolutely wild. Jesus is upset. Right? He's overturning tables. Animals are running around, making noises. Coins are bouncing off a stone. People are yelling and screaming. The disciples are probably standing there like, oh, we've seen this before. This is new for you people in Jerusalem. But we've been hanging with this guy for about 3 years. So it's a wild scene. It's a wild scene. But again, Jesus is challenging the established powers. This is part of the tradition that Jesus is railing against. Okay? So when we think about Jesus, and we've already talked about him as a revolutionary, and he was. Jesus of Nazareth definitely was a revolutionary. Now we're looking at him and saying, well, who is he? Who is the revolution against? Right? Is it against a handful of people? Not really. It's against something a lot larger than that. It's against the powers. It's against the powers and principalities. It's against the organization that has been set up, that Jesus says it needs to be fixed. And if you're part of that organization, and if you're happy with the organization, the way it's running, well, we don't want it fixed. And Jesus says, okay, well, then, game on. So that's what we're looking at. All right, we will go ahead and continue next Sunday with the powers of principalities.